Hello there, EV here. Welcome to the full review of the Riotoro CR280. If you're new to this channel, then, well, you probably are new to this channel, then thank you very much for coming, and I hope you enjoy the video. Let me know at the end, comments, likes, dislikes, that sort of stuff. And yeah, normally, and this is the most irritating part of doing these videos, is I do the intro at the end. So I'm absolutely shot right now, and I'm melting because of lights. So please don't take this as a overall quality of what's to come. So without further ado, let's get into that. Also, I generally forget to add these somewhere in the video, so if you want to support the channel in any way, then links in the video description. You'll find all sorts of various ways of doing so. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will catch you in a second for the bulk of the video. At the end, you'll have the thermal testing with all sorts of tests, and then we'll have some B-roll footage of the final rig. So, I'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye. First things first, the unboxing experience. Now, I'm not one to be won over by a pretty cardboard box, but it's nice to have some little packaging upgrades here and there. But as long as the packaging brings the product to me completely undamaged, that's all I need. The Riotoro CR280 has the minimum required packaging, being a couple of polystyrene bookends and a plastic bag to prevent small scuffs and scratches. That's not a dig at the product, but it is worth a mention. So, with the packaging out of the way, the Riotoro CR280 is a mini ITX case, the first we've reviewed on this channel, and features a predominantly steel construction, pretty rare for a £40 or $60 case. The front I/O can be found at the bottom of the front panel, great for those who plan to have this system on their desk, and features two USB 3.0 ports to the left and right, power and reset buttons to the left and right, and mic and headphone jacks again left and right, with a drive activity LED dead center, a nicely laid out front I/O. Running up the side of the case, excuse the plastic protective layer over the red trim, we can appreciate the steel front, top and side panels. We're not talking thick steel here, but it's coated well enough to take a good few scrapes without showing wear and tear. At the top of the front panel, the Riotoro name can be found cut out of the steel with a red backing of sorts. We'll check the other side of that later. And while we're here, you may be able to spot the slightly out of focus finish defects to the top right of the label. Those aren't scratches, but appear to be some sort of debris that was painted over during manufacture. Not a big deal, but it's worth keeping tabs on these things to form an overall feel of the quality as we go. One of the major features of this case's design are the perforated front and top panels. Again, these are steel panels, and this sort of feature on a budget case like this just makes it look and feel like it's punching well above its weight, or more specifically, its price bracket. You may have noticed there are some plastic clips poking out of the top panel. These are supporting a mesh on the underside, which is a nice to have to reduce dust ingress through the top panel, but it does spoil the clean style somewhat in my opinion. But of course you can always just remove them. The CR280 does feature a plastic side panel window, and I think everyone would appreciate seeing a tempered glass side panel here, but I think we can also all appreciate that that would bump the price up a fair bit, which is not the point of this case. On the other hand, the T-shaped logo punched into the side panel that lines up with the top of the aforementioned window is such a clean and attractive detail. It's a damn good looking logo that can be easily thrown anywhere and not look tacky, out of place, or even cheap. To the rear of the case, we find the motherboard rear I/O position to the left and the 120mm fan position to the right. Just below that, we find the whoa, back up. The fan grille is domed. It's domed to prevent contact with the fan blades regardless of the fan's design or orientation. That's just one hell of a detail that just doesn't feature on cases in this price bracket, or even higher price brackets for that matter. And yes, you see rubber grommets, not just washers, these are included with all fans. The sheer attention to detail on offer here is just incredible considering the price bracket. Okay, moving on. Below the fan position, the PCI Express slot covers can be found, which unfortunately includes a punch-out cover. And the ATX power supply unit position can be found right at the bottom. And the offside panel is just a clean steel panel with another T-shaped logo up to the top left. Apologies if I'm coming across as some sort of fanboy for this case, but I'm doing my best to show all objective features, but feel free to disregard all of my opinions if you feel I've lost my mind. Something that's worth mentioning is that I don't look into any cases before I review them at all, and that's got to be one of the most surprising external overviews of any case I've worked with on this channel. But it wouldn't be anywhere near as exciting to me if the case costed twice as much, but it's one hell of a start. Okay, back to the review. Removing the side panels is as simple as removing a single screw. These screws don't have retention clips, so you'll need to keep track of where you put them, not exactly one of life's biggest problems, but something that is less than ideal is the lack of any purchase to remove the side panels. Normally you'd expect some sort of punch-out handle to provide some sort of leverage for your fingers, but nothing like that exists here, so you'll need to get some fingernails involved or apply a few more fingerprints to the side panels than you would have liked. As for the rigidity of the side panels themselves, it's positive news here since there's very little flex to either of them. Harking back to a commenter from a previous video, you don't need 1.2mm SECC steel to form a decent side panel, although more is better in that regard. So let's get into the insides of the case. Well, not so fast. First we need to look at the final external panel, which is of course the front panel. To each inside corner of the front panel we find a metal tab that runs through the front of the chassis. These are really simple to disengage but are really fiddly to work with to get the panel back on, but of course we'll cover that later. The front panel itself is, as far as I'm concerned, the greatest disappointment of this case. From an overview it doesn't look half bad, the perforations look good and it's an all steel construction, but if you look closer at the details, things start to fall apart. The red trim appears to be an adhesively backed plastic strip that's folded and taped at the ends, not exactly matching the quality we've seen so far. And the same goes for the name tag at the top. It's essentially an adhesively attached soft plastic sticker. The top label isn't too bad, but I have less confidence about the red trim holding for a long period of time. As for the front of the chassis, here we find two individual fan filters that can be removed from the side, but the front panel will always need removing first. Two individual filters sounds like added value and quality, but I can't think of a really good reason why it couldn't just be a single large filter. Two just means twice as much effort is required to clean them out, and they're not all that easy to replace. But here's a turn up for the books. You may have noticed the white bar underneath the front I/O on the first pass of the filters. If we look to the underside of the case, you'll notice that this is a light bar that's formed with a static red LED, a clear plastic diffuser and a white plastic enclosure. It's actually pretty effective and we'll see it in action in the B-roll towards the end of the video. The underside of the case is where things go a little off the rails. You'll notice the arrows with the HDD lettering next to them. They are for a 3.5-inch hard disk drive of course. But as for the various other holes around the case, there are 6 smaller holes that look like they could support 2.5-inch drives, but you'll only be able to screw 2 screws into one drive and then attempt to make up a third screw elsewhere, but good luck with a fourth. But no 2.5-inch drives are officially supported down here. The manual alludes to a mounting of a 120mm fan at the bottom. It's written in but not illustrated, and like the 2.5-inch drive potential, you could only really fix 2 screws into a 120mm fan here if you really wanted a 120mm fan here. And quickly before we move on, there are also 4 soft plastic feet at the base. Right, now let's get inside the case. To the rear we find one of the 2 included fans. These spin up to around 1500 RPM and are a little noisy, but if you're on a budget, they'll do well enough. Underneath the fan is 1 replaceable PCI Express slot cover and 1 breakaway cover. I'm not a fan of this approach, I'd much prefer to see 2 replaceable slot covers. But in all honesty, it's very unlikely that you won't be using at least a single slot PCI Express card, so overall, not too bad. The base of the case has 4 rubber pads to support an ATX power supply unit, and the underside has a mesh filter that could have been a higher quality filter like one of the front ones, for the sake of consistency if you get what I mean. And the front of the case has all sorts of holes for ventilation, but like I mentioned before, not a lot of officially supported mounting options. And of course the wires from the front I/O, which are all pristinely black. As for the front, this case officially supports 2 120mm fans, and here we find the second included 120mm fan, which I forgot to mention are 3-pin fans, so you can control them with a DC fan curve in the BIOS or link them to a fan hub and use a PWM fan curve, among many other ways. And up top is room for another 2 120mm fans. Here you can get a closer glimpse of those plastic pins that hold the mesh we mentioned earlier. One quick point on the AIO situation. As far as I'm concerned, you're looking at a maximum 240mm radiator and 1 or at a push 2 120mm radiators. It's the clashing of radiators between the front and top that you'll need to look out for. As for the front of the motherboard tray, there's a strange power supply unit pressure tab to the left that I don't feel is necessary, although it can help with power supply unit vibration noise reduction, but could be completely irrelevant if you were going to use an SFX power supply unit. And the only other notable part are the couple of 2.5-inch drive mounting positions to the top right, which have pre-installed grommets for the screws. Actually, it's worth pointing out the cable management routing options right at the top of the motherboard tray, plenty of room for bulky power connectors among other cables. As for the back of the motherboard tray, here's a closer look at those 2.5-inch drive mounts to the left. There are also a good few cable management tabs, I'd say a solid amount for a case of this size. Shifting the cables out of the way reveals a really interesting mechanism. No, not the box, but check out how it's clamped in place. It's a bit overkill for holding an accessories box, but it's a nice touch. You can dismount the box by unscrewing the bracket slightly, lifting it up and tightening the screw to hold it up, and then you're free to get access to all the accessories for your build. Of course, that's not all it's there for. It's clearly a pretty interesting way to store a 3.5-inch drive. So this kicks up the potential system capacity by potentially 12 terabytes. But let's be more realistic and say for an extra £50 you'll get yourself 2 terabytes of storage back there, and it's easily concealed by the power supply unit position. Not bad. Something that really needs pointing out back here is the sheer amount of space. I know that's a really weird thing to say about an ITX case, but I can fit my fat thumb in the space between the motherboard tray and the side panel position. That's freaking awesome. Okay, since my thumb isn't a standard unit of measure, I'll still keep applying though, it actually clocks in at about 23mm, which is nearly as thick as a standard fan. As for the accessories box, it holds a smorgasbord of screws, many of which are specific for this case. It also holds the manual and the warranty slip, which is in Portuguese. The manual is really something to behold though, my kind of reading. Seriously, any more than one page and I'm bored. If you really want to read the manual, you'll need to head over to their website sales page, go to the downloads tab and download the manual from there. It's worth doing as a sanity check. Right off the bat, it appears I'm missing a set of 4 screws. Pay attention to the set at the top right. There are also a few pieces I want to point out that are misleading. I know Riotoro aren't British or American, but mistaking a 3.5-inch drive position with a 2.5-inch drive position is a pretty basic error. It also points out 4 positions for the side panel thumb screws in the corners, where only 2 thumb screws exist in the centers. Now I know these are small things that I'm picking up here, but since this is a full review, it's all relevant. Regardless of which country products are designed in, these sorts of things should be checked and approved properly. But something I think we can all appreciate is a warranty. Well, not unless you're a modder. Checking out the back of the user manual tells us that the latest limited product warranty can be found at their website, and heading over to the website tells us that every CR280 comes with a 3-year repair coverage and 90-day support. Okay, granted the 90-day support is pretty strange, I'm pretty sure anyone can call them up to ask a question, but the 3-year warranty is great. Anyway, enough of the manual, let's talk screws. First up are 8 thumb screws for 2.5-inch drives, then there are a couple of spare screws which they say could be used for radiators. Fair enough, but I'd recommend using the screws that come with your radiators to maintain their warranties. Next up are 8 fan screws with accompanying grommets, then we have 4 motherboard screws, and then we have what look like 4 radiator screws. Again, the screws that come with your radiator or AIO, use those. And finally, we have a few wire ties. So let's get on to actually building a system in this thing. But just before we do that, here's how a 3.5-inch drive would look if you installed it to the base of the case, but that's not my style, so we'll be moving on without it. So my favourite starting point for building a system is installing the power supply unit. It helps to weigh the case down, particularly when the case in question is relatively light. You'll notice the metal tab to the rear of the motherboard tray is providing pressure to the power supply unit against these rubber pads at the base. This is going to help to transfer any vibrations of the power supply unit through to the case. It's also worth pointing out that we're going fan side down in this case, since the graphics card is going to be floating right above the power supply unit and we don't want them competing for air. And just to be that guy, you can install the power supply unit either way, or even use all the available screw holes for an 8 screw secure mount like this. I need to install 3 2.5-inch drives into this case, so I'm going to need to utilize the base of the case somewhat to hold one of the drives. You can use 2 of the screw holes very simply, they seem to be designed for a 2.5-inch drive, but getting a 3rd screw in was more of a challenge. To make up the difference in level, I positioned a rubber washer underneath the drive and then used a couple of rubber washers to get some purchase on the larger holes for the screw. It's not pretty, but it doesn't have to be since it's not going to be seen again, and please don't lecture me on 4 screws for a hard disk drive, 3 is plenty like this. So now we've got a 2.5-inch drive mounted to the base, we need to mount the other 2 drives to the motherboard tray. Since there are pre-installed rubber grommets in place, we need to use the provided 2.5-inch drive screws, like this one, more like a thumb screw, which is quite a bit longer than your average 2.5-inch drive screw, and has also nicely knurled edges, so you don't have to use a screwdriver. You know how screws work, so here's what a couple of 2.5-inch drives look like in the back. Pretty good in my opinion. As for the system, which for a few reasons will miraculously change later for our newer test system, we have a Gigabyte Z270N Gaming 5 motherboard, which will be changed out for an ASUS Z170i Pro Gaming. We have 2 8GB sticks of G.Skill's Ripjaws 5. Our graphics card is an EVGA GTX 1070 for the win, and we'll be using an i7 6700K, which will be cooled by a Cryorig C7, which will later be swapped out for a Noctua L9i. It's a shame that the L9i tested so well compared to the Cryorig C7 in the low-profile cooler showdown, since it's such a good-looking cooler, especially crammed onto an ITX motherboard like this. For those of you who like the look of this, there is a copper version, the Cryorig C7CU, coming out in the near future, and we'll try to cover that cooler's performance when it's available. So for now we have our system, however temporary the system is, so let's get it inside the case. There's not a lot to be said about popping the rear I/O shield into position, so there it is. As for dropping this chunk of the system in, it's a fairly safe and clean process, 4 screws later, and we're done. So all that's left is the graphics card. Heading to the rear of the case, we first need to take the PCI Express slot cover screw cover off, and then of course for a 2-slot card we need to clear out both slots. Like I mentioned earlier, one of these slots is a breakaway panel. I don't like it, but it's not that bad. Since it's only one slot that is a breakaway panel, you'll only have one blank PCI Express slot, so like I said, it's really not that bad. Getting the graphics card's total volume into the case was ever so slightly fiddly. This is a 267mm graphics card, and this case can take up to a 290mm card. However, that 290mm maximum means you wouldn't be able to fit a 120mm fan into the lower front of the case. I wouldn't recommend a card above 270mm if you wanted a standard 25mm thick 120mm fan in the lower front as well. Now we've covered the graphics card's formalities, all that's left for the graphics card is to clamp it to the case and relieve the motherboard a bit by replacing the screws previously removed. And of course there's that PCI Express slot cover screw cover panel that can be replaced if you want to. For the sake of testing purposes, I'm going to replace it so we don't change the airflow characteristics of the case, which will likely be crucial around this area. And let's not forget the power to the graphics card. That would be detrimental to the performance of the system, but not connecting it would keep the thermals down, so swings and roundabouts of a sort. So that's most of the build complete, but before we panel up, let's take a quick look at the party in the back. Alright, there's no party, but it's really busy back here. There's not a huge amount more that I could do here since this case claims to be able to handle an ATX power supply unit, and with that, the ATX power supply unit cables that come with such a power supply unit. So that's what we're gonna test. And as far as I'm concerned, the CR280 passes cable management with flying colours. I got a little creative with some Velcro straps, but that's on me. However, if I were to request an improvement in this area, I'd love to see the motherboard tray extend to cover the entirety of the lower section, and include some large grommets for cable routing. That would tidy up the mess of the cables that gets a little difficult to clean up, and that would open the opportunity for a full-size tempered glass side panel, or plastic side panel to keep the budget down. But if that was a road to be travelled, an extended duct wouldn't go amiss to cover and direct the front I/O cables towards the rear of the motherboard tray. And yes, even though I've really enjoyed building in and discovering all this case has to offer, I, as well as anyone, can critique anything as part of a review. But to round this off, I am at some point going to create some sort of award system for case reviews by somewhat popular request from subscribers. I think many would agree that this case should hands down receive a Cable Management King Award, or something along those lines. I'll get to work on that soon. So that's the build, now it's time to panel up. The side panels are super simple to replace, and I think a single thumb screw is the future of all small form factor side panel replacement. However, I had a couple of issues aligning the hooks on this side panel in particular, but now we're back to the most disappointing part of the case, the front panel. Now I don't know if I'm discovering some previously underlying learning difficulties, but I found it really awkward to replace the front panel. As far as I can tell, it's required to get your fingers through the gap between the panel and the chassis in order to pull the metal tabs out into the slots in the chassis. This isn't picked up in the user manual, but if you own this case and know better, please post it in a comment below and I'll pin it for all to see. And please don't take that as me being lazy and not researching this case properly. Anyway, just before we get into testing, remember I mentioned the motherboard tray and the CPU cooler was going to change. Well, that's happened now. All specs are in the video description, and this updated system is what we'll be using for the foreseeable future. We'll take a look at the finished build towards the end, but first I'm going to test this system with its included fans first to gather our as it comes test data, and then we're going to cram this case full of 120mm 2200 RPM EK Vardar F4 120 ER fans. And when I say cram, I mean put as many in as possible and sensible. So that means we're going to be removing the two included fans and place two 2200 RPM fans in the front, one in the rear and only one to the top rear of this case. I know there's going to be someone that wants to tell me I should use the top front position as an intake or an exhaust, but from previous testing I've done with a lot of previous cases, that position is always found to bear no improvements for air cooling, and in many cases has a negative effect. And there are plenty of obvious reasons which we'll cover in the future at some point, but it is an excellent position for water cooling. So let's go over all of that test data, but first the rules of the charts as quickly as possible. We'll be using the Prime 95 and Thermark test chart as an example before we go through them all. The case we're looking at is dead set center in all charts, but to make it more obvious and undoubtable, you'll see this gradient just behind it so you know exactly where to specifically find the CR280. Unfortunately, we've only got 3 cases in these test graphs since we've reset the graphs with the new test system, and we've only just currently started repopulating them. Anyway, all cases are shown in order of size, smallest to largest from left to right. However, the test bench on the left is regarded as a 0-litre case, since the volume of air it has available could be seen as unlimited. Going over colours, for all but one of the graphs, the purple bar represents case volume, blue represents CPU temps, green represents GPU temps, and in the other graphs you'll see an orange bar that represents average frames per second. The test system consists of an i7-6700K CPU locked at the clock speed of 4 GHz, and cooled by a very low profile Noctua L9i. Even though I could have thrown in a much larger cooler, this system needs to be as compatible with as many future cases as possible so we can compare everything and maintain fair test principles as much as possible. We also have an EVGA GTX 1070 for the win that's clocked at 2 GHz. I haven't actually touched the clock speed there, it just likes being at 2 GHz as long as the cooling is sufficient. Speaking of cooling, all fans are set to maximum speeds, so we can eliminate fan curves that can muddy the waters, even more so if it's being tested in a high ambient temperature environment. And lastly, the temperatures you see here are in degrees Celsius and consist of the raw temperature of the component minus the ambient temperature of the room to normalize the statistics and make them directly comparable, otherwise known as a delta T style metric. But for those of you who are interested, the ranges of ambient temperatures between all the tests were between about 20 and 25 degrees Celsius. We're going to try something a little unorthodox on this channel and show the as it comes and max fan test results in a staggered fashion so you can see the improvements of changing and adding the fans in. First up, we have Prime 95 and Thermark for a 10-minute torture test, and that shows a nearly 15 degrees Celsius increase in the CPU temperature compared to the test bench, and over 20 degrees Celsius increase in the temperature for the GPU compared to the test bench. You might be wondering why the CPU bar of the CR280 fades to red. Well, that's because the CPU hit 100 degrees and started thermal throttling. We'll check that out in a second. Looking at a maximum fans result shows a technical increase in the delta T on the CPU due to ambient temperature differences. It still seems to thermal throttle where the Mastercase Pro 3 didn't, and I think that has something to do with the higher filter density of the CR280. But remember, you'll see better results with a larger CPU cooler. As for the thermal throttling during the Prime 95 and Thermark test, in the As It Comes test we saw the CPU drop to 3.91 GHz and the GPU drop to 1.81 GHz. But what's interesting is that when we added all those fans in for the max fans test, the CPU thermal throttled more and the GPU thermal throttled less. I think the only assumption we can make is that adding a fast bottom fan to the front of the case cooled the GPU more but added the heat into the case, which only caused the CPU to get hotter at a rate that even adding the other fans couldn't handle. As for Unigine Superposition, we noticed a classic drop in thermals when we add more fans, but it's clear to see that there is some substantial bottlenecking of the GPU's cooling system due to that power supply unit below. Not enough to affect performance, but I'd be concerned about having an ITX graphics card with an ATX power supply unit in this case for extended gaming sessions. Dirt Showdown is a pretty light title to run, which is clear from the consistently high frame rates, and we see a classic reduction in thermals as we add more fans. Rise of the Tomb Raider presents a similar classic drop from the standard setup to the max fan setup. Don't be weirded out by the solid 60 frames per second frame rate. I always check that VSync is off. This just happens to be a 60 frames per second Rise of the Tomb Raider system. Hitman interestingly shows us a trade in thermals as we add more fans, the CPU appearing to capture more of the heat coming off the better cooled GPU. And lastly, GTA 5 ends the testing on a classic drop in thermals. It's worth remembering that none of these gaming style benchmarks did we find an improvement in performance as we added more fans, but as all the fans were running at full speed, you'd see a better thermals and noise control if you added more fans at a lower RPM without sacrificing the performance. So there we have it, the Riotoro CR280. Now, would I recommend this case? Well, it's a little difficult to say. It does have some interesting red lighting at the bottom. It's not RGB, so, you know, goes off on that tick. Although, you couldn't have a red strip at the top and then have RGB lighting at the bottom. It just would not suit. The thing that I'm a little bit hesitant on is that it doesn't have a tempered glass side panel. Now, I wouldn't mind the price going up for that tempered glass side panel, wouldn't mind adding an extra £15–20 to the case to include that, and I think in this day and age you kind of need to have that sort of feature to be able to compete against so many other cases, such as the Cooler Master Masterbox Lite 3.1 tempered glass edition. You can get that for about £40 or £50. That's pretty close to the price point of this one, and I think this does go up to sometimes £60 or so, which is a little bit pricey, so that's pretty much that. But I would recommend it, I think, but it's difficult. You'd only really get this if you really like the style of the case, and you could cope with things like a lack of tempered glass side paneling and no RGB feature on the front bottom area, but if you particularly like the bottom I/O on there so you could use it on your desk, then I can understand that, and that might be one reason for you to get this case. You could also mod it here and there to upgrade some of those features. You could mod a tempered glass side panel, you could do quite a lot with it, but that's up to you. So one thing I did want to cover, which is not to do with the CR280, is there is an anniversary coming up. It's not anything to do with the channel, really, although it has somewhat a connection. It's actually only, I think it's a day or two until the 1 month anniversary of my communication to Overclockers UK about their shoddy advertising standards, in my opinion. Now, what they could have done in that time is got back in touch with me and have a discussion about this, but instead they've gone down the road of, and lawfully, that's quite correct, they've gone down the road of adding a privacy complaint to the video I did, not the first one, but actually the second one, where I included a phone conversation with Overclockers UK, and rightfully so, they can include, or they can go for a privacy complaint, because I didn't actually authorize any sort of a third-party exposure of that conversation, so that's in their legal right to do that. And in the future, I do have to be more careful with these things and say, you know, can I record this, or are you aware that this is recorded? Can we continue, and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's something I didn't do this time around, and that's a mistake on my part. But there is something to be gleaned from this. Overclockers UK would clearly, rather than spend 1 month compiling some sort of, or at least spending an hour compiling some sort of response to all of my questions, they decided to wait, sit on all the information, not respond, probably because they don't want to kick up any more fuss than they have to on this, and get any more exposure at all to this situation than they actually really have to, because the Advertising Standards Authority might get involved again. But they would rather silence my ability to be able to talk about this rather than respond. Now, I don't mean silence in terms of their issue and copyright takedowns, but silence more of a point of they would go down a legal route of blocking off information about the subject. So they haven't gone full EA or Nintendo, and they're not, you know, copyright striking the video. If they did, I think they'd know that the Streisand effect would have its full exposure. So, yeah, I'd probably recommend not doing that. But we do know that Overclockers UK is watching these videos, and they are authorizing these things. So, well, I believe it's going to be authorizing it, because I can't see anyone else doing it, not unless it's some very strange person, because I haven't actually got any information as to who's authorized it. I can only assume it's Overclockers UK, and if not, Overclockers UK might want to get involved and start, you know, handling the situation a little better than they have already. So, yes, Overclockers UK, if you are watching, if you are listening, then please, let's go about this in a civil manner. Let's have a discussion about this. I will do my best, and I'll do my utmost to make sure that I disclose all of the communication between each other. Sorry for the mic bump there. And we can have a conversation about this. We can discuss this like adults, instead of throwing around, you know, stop talking about me and that stuff like children. So so I'm waiting for their response. Again, I will get in contact with them in the next day or two to see what they say. They might have found their complaints department by then, because they were in London last time and they didn't know where they were. So it's funny how that happens when you talk about difficult subjects. So yes. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video, and I will catch you drilling. I'll catch you drilling. I'll catch you in the next one, which should be the Cooler Master Masterbox. Cooler Master Masterbox? Oh, the Cooler Master Q300L. Thanks for watching. See you guys. Also forgot to mention, sorry, there is drilling on the background. That's not mine, it's somebody else's. You can get this case through the Amazon affiliate links in the video description. I'm not sure how many places around the world stock it, but I do put Amazon affiliate links for about 6 or 7 different countries around the world, so you might be able to find one in your region if you really want one. I should put this earlier in the video, but I don't. And you can also, if you want to, join the Patreon page and donate $1 per month to the channel, and we can, you know, get in more cases, get in more products, and review things in a similar fashion, but if not improved in the future. So thanks guys, see you next time, bye bye.